Yeah, I guess starting out, how did you come to be interested in the politics of Muslim food practices? Disgust, halal, sacrifice, certification. Was there a moment in your fieldwork or life that pulled you towards these themes of sensory experience, ethics, and religious life?
Okay, thanks so much. Yeah, I think there were a number. I think, many people often ask me that, why you're so
Yeah.
interested in this strange topic for so long, especially my friends who are not from academics. And I think that, so the one I always think of was, I was very fortunate. I think I was around 15 years of age, and my father was had got a fellowship to spend some time in the United States. And so the family joined him in the US. And I think that
Hmm.
experience of being in Virginia, where we kind
Yeah.
of encountered Muslims from various parts of the world with very different
Yeah.
ideas of halal, you know?
Yeah.
So coming from like, South Africa and very much Indo-Pak kind of background, halal
Hmm.
is pretty much clear. It has to be slaughtered by a Muslim. There has to be this tasmiyah that's recited. But in the
Hmm.
US, ideas like the people of the book or the Ahlul Kitab were not just ideas, they were actually being practiced by people. So I remember one day, being on an outing with some people from
Yeah.
the mosque community, and then we stopped at Burger King, and this was like, oh my goodness. And then I listened to them and I ate it. So, because my family background was open enough to tell us, well, these are different ideas, of halal. So that was the one idea. And I think I remember as a 15-year-old, then going through the Quran, going through different kinds of things to understand this question, like of this Ahlul Kitab, where all of a sudden, there's all these ideas we've been brought up with. But on the other hand, actually Christians and, the food of the people of the Christians and Jews is okay. And this is so there's one moment. Another moment I think come from growing up in South Africa in a minority context. And this was some years later when I was still doing my undergraduate and graduate studies in finance and accounting. So that's
Yeah.
my earlier background, which again speaks to economy interest. But this was a different experience. We had gone with some friends on a kind of a tour into the Lesotho mountains, and we were in these mountains, and we thought, well, here we have organic chicken, free range roaming around. Let's try this. Let's buy from these locals and let's slaughter it. And it was a funny experience in itself because I had never had experience, and my cousin who I was with, and the whole process was, first time. But what really stood out, at least in the sense you're speaking about disgust and was effective, I recall was that there were some Europeans present. And for them, this act of going to take this chicken and slaughter it, even though they were meat eaters, was completely horrifying. And there was a whole emotional moment where they broke down, and one of my friends was kind of speaking to them, explaining to them, so these were these moments, I think, which kind of interested me both in the kind of the complexity of halal, right? And how
Yeah.
complicated it is for Muslims, but also this broader politics where animal slaughter, something which many Muslims who experience slaughter, think about halal, think about Qurbani, find it troubling, but also part of everyday life. Sometimes troubling, sometimes just ordinary, whatever it might be. But here was a whole kind of idea in the kind of liberal public sphere that actually, even though we meat eaters, we are disgusted by this. This is barbaric. And so these were
Hmm.
some things I think that when I think back about it, these were these early moments, which kind of like excited me in this problem. But as I said,
Yeah.
I was actually a undergrad, and I did postgrad as well in finance and accounting. And so it was only later when I left those fields and came into religious studies and the anthropology of religion that suddenly this all started coming together. I was like, wait a minute, halal
Yeah.
certification. Well, this is a bureaucratization. It was very familiar to me, given my auditing background. And so that's how I kind of got into it. After that, I think things started to emerge, different
Yeah.
interests appeared, different contexts, things like that. Yeah.
I mean, growing up in California, there was a huge debate around like
Mm.
Zabia, non Zabia. Actually, I was discussing this with a friend, trying to explain to her, what the difference was. But, I totally can relate to that debate. And I think that's what attracted me to your work. It was so like front and center for a lot of Muslim Americans, especially in our communities. Yeah, let's begin with your 2019 article titled Disgust as Embodied Critique. You build on Sarah Ahmed to frame disgust not as an automatic, but a historically shaped and relational sort of concept. How did that help you think through disgust in Muslim neighborhoods like Dongri? And can you give a context of Dongri in that?
Absolutely. Okay, maybe I should start with that. So Dongri is a very famous and also very infamous Muslim-dominated area in South Mumbai. It's kind of part of the spaces that are often known as Muhammad Ali Road. Many people have spoke about kind of Muslim ghettoization, but Mumbai, being a particularly important center where Muslims, areas like Dongri were very old historical areas, right? Emerging in 19th, early 20th century, dominated by Muslim trade and labor. In the 1990s, these areas come under attack by the Hindu right wing. The 1992-93 riots, this is one of the areas that was attacked, saw a lot of violence and became increasingly over time like this Muslim-dominated kind of locale. So as scholars have argued, it's kind of it's a vibrant space, lots of different kinds of Muslims, different backgrounds, different sectarian, regional affiliations. But at the same time, it's also, a space where infrastructural neglect is quite clear. The presence of the state is often not very present. Muslim organizations have to organize a lot of even basic civic amenities for themselves. And so it's an interesting space, both a marginal space, but also a space where the kind of the language and the materials and the food of, Indian Muslim culture and things like that are flourishing. So I was drawn to that. But why? So disgust is, of course, as you of course know, it's something which animates, right, the kind of the Hindu nationalist or Hindutva imaginary. The Muslim as disgusting, the Muslim as imagined as a butcher, as not just someone who does things that are problematic, like clothing or prayer and things, but also someone whose practice of, say, animal slaughter is read as a kind of an indifference to animal suffering. And through that, this idea that, they actually don't have ethics.
And that's kind of like represented in popular culture through like film as well, like
Absolutely.
Gangs of Wasseypur, I think. Those things. Yeah,
absolutely. Right. So this idea of the ethical subject, the Muslim is not really an ethical subject because they're indifferent to the very basic substance of ethics in this imagination, which is, the recognition of animal suffering. So disgust was there, right? It's in the literature. It's been spoken about. As you said, it's part of Hindu nationalist rhetoric. It's part of film representations, right? So it's circulating around.
Yeah.
And at the heart of this, of course, is this question of this butcher, of meat practice, and sites like, butchers or consumption of meat, the cow gullies, the famous streets in Muhammad Ali Road full of food. Sometimes I heard people from outside the area say, I went there once and I just saw the meat hanging there. I just saw the pieces of chicken, this was like horrifying to me. So it's kind of part of some kind of public idea that when you enter the space, you may encounter both Muslims, but also meat. And so because of my interest in halal, this topic was there. But the other side of it was that I was working with people that I had met and made contact with in the city who were some of them butchers or traders or just ordinary people going out to eat. And of course, for them, the same kind of register of disgust was not operating. So coming into someone, so encountering the work of Sarah Ahmed was interesting because she's situated historically, similar also to the example I gave you, right, of a kind of a liberal kind of aversion to the sights and sounds of slaughter as somehow barbaric. So there were different kinds of threads coming together. And so I thought that it could be interesting to think about, about what happens when disgust, gets activated. What happens when Muslims experience disgust? Is it the same thing? Is it the same thing when the Muslim subject who's accustomed, who's kind of, who accustomed or practices or obliged to practice something like Qurbani or practice something like halal slaughter is at the same time sitting in a political context where that very practice is marked as problematic. And I guess, and I was interested in what happens there, right? Do people, do they subscribe, to the same idea? Do they become vegetarian? And that is obviously part of it, right? To subscribe to the ideas of disgust, to kind of purify the self in the image, or were there other kinds of operations happening? So this was something, thinking through disgust and thinking through the ethnographies, I tried to kind of weave them together.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, and you introduced disgust like sort of as this embodied critique, right? And embodied has a certain signification, especially within anthropology. And could you unpack that a bit? And what does it mean when this critique happens through the body and through gestures, refusals, or smells?
Interesting. Thank you. That's a serious question. I guess, if we start with this idea of critique, right? I think on the one, what inspired me to think through this question of critique was the idea that often in anthropology, we are studying our interlocutors as subjects who inhabit their worlds, who live in particular ways, right, who in different ways, right? This idea of otherness, of difference. So we look at language, we look at people's life, we look at their practices. But very often the idea is not that they themselves are critical interlocutors on their own condition. The idea on some level is that they may actually perhaps not be aware of some of these issues. And some of the, they could, for example, and it is presented, I think it's presented as a kind of a trope in the scholarship that perhaps they are not aware of the stakes of politics because of their everyday life. They may not be aware of the kind of ideologies and discourses of religion or Islam because they are just lay people. So there's these various ways in which, and of course, these are older ideas, but anyway, the general idea, I think for me was this idea, right, that our interlocutors are very often presented as people whom we study. They are objects of study. We study their subjectivity, but not them as subjects. Subjects who live in the world, who form their own kinds of critiques of the situation through their own language. And so that was something of their own lives, not only language, of course, right? Practices.
Yeah.
So that was the one side. And I think, so thinking through that, the embodiment also speaks to this question of critique, right? In the kind of, critique as a kind of academic activity, as the sifting through of materials, as the kind of, the kind of scholarly work of, looking across contexts, across fields, across subjects in order to identify some kind of insight of various ways through power, through various kinds of operations. But embodiment, I think, well, of course, not overall, but it seems to me that the idea was, well, we have this Enlightenment idea of a body-mind distinction, but actually that distinction doesn't hold, and people or beings are embodied beings that inhabit the world in various ways. It's almost as if in that embodiment work, the work of critique is not necessarily there. So you are immersed in a world, you are in the world, and you don't necessarily have that reflexive capacity, or that reflexive capacity is not always there. And so the idea with disgust, at least say these moments, this was a fascinating, I'm still good friends with Shahab and Shuaib, who I mentioned in the paper. And it was very much a chance encounter. And what was interesting for me was that at that moment, like running away from the charging bull and, hiding on the side of the road, the first thing that my interlocutor asked me is, well, this must be strange for you, right? And so he immediately recognized me as somebody not from there, from my comportment, from the way I speak or whatever. But then also another level of reflection saying, well, this is our place, which we are familiar with, and you are not from here. So already a kind of a reflexivity built into the interaction, which I kind of, at the time, I don't think I had the language for it. I was just recording it. And later on came to it and think that, well, people are aware of various things. And then, of course, as he spoke about his brother and his brother being disgusted by this whole situation, he then tells me, but look what the state does, they don't build. And so I was trying to sit with these moments, where people are both talking about the personal. They're talking about this affect of like my brother vomiting, but at the same time shifting register to talk about the structural, to talk about the space, to talk about the things which we often think are what academics speak about. But I think, So anyway, so I think there was these two that were, that's what I was trying to think with,
I mean, that scene in the article is very powerful where Mukhtar links the bull's distress to improper halal practices, right? In that whole Dionar abattoir scene. I don't know how to pronounce it correctly, but that moment sort of brings together this sort of like a confluence of ethics, infrastructure, and that embodied critique you're talking about. Could you elaborate on that a bit?
Okay, thanks. So I think I mentioned the one part, right, in my first explanation, the one part of the vignette is coming back to me. But that was interesting because as we spoke, on the one hand, it's like, things are not looked after. There's no order here, in terms of the sense that this facility, and this is something I often got from people I spoke to say, look, the facilities that serve as kind of Muslim life, one of them being abattoirs and butcher spaces, are actually old and dilapidated and far, outdated for contemporary needs. But the other was then his observation, well, actually, a more kind of shifting to the register of halal and of religion itself as an ethical archive. So not just as a ritual that you do, but something that is also concerned, right, with the sentience of an animal, with its well-being, with how it responds. And he kind of then speaks about, this charging bull. He's like, look at the bull. Look at the bull, look how agitated it is. And again,
Yeah.
turns that back onto the infrastructure. Well, over here, we don't have the space, so there's a lot of bulls in one space. So, in a sense, yeah, I think these moments tell us, right, that the question of ethics and the question of the infrastructure in which we kind of live and work, the built environment, even the way it looks and feels, are not just neutral things, right? They matter a lot to people, and they kind of impact and they shape even what is possible,
Yeah.
So, and we see that, of course, with say the way that halal certification emerges, where certain aspects of halal ritual are turned into infrastructural parts of industrial animal slaughter. So that's one way it's done. But here, it's kind of the lack of that, doing something else. Yeah.
So you also write about Qurbani, about Muhabbat and Qadr. And could you define those in terms of sacrificial intimacy and how it sort of pushes back against the dominant portrayals of Muslims in the Indian context as violent or cruel?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I think I can start by telling you a story which I'm trying to now write with, which got me into this. So as I explained, right, I was coming into the field thinking there's different ways in which people approach this question. Like, how do we put value? I'm using qadr, right? How do we put a value on this question of the slaughter? Like where shall it be? How is it done? Etc. And this seems to be, it's universal, but different. I mean, it's something that different, But of course, we speak about different societies, cultures, times. You have different assessments of this. And anyway, so I was kind of like, kind of starting field work, going around to butcher spaces, trying to understand this economy. And one day I come across Sunday afternoon. I'm in Doppelgrim, and I see these two men who are in a kind of a fountain area. So it's a walled off space that some religious organizations had donated as a water fountain. And what these two friends were doing was they were shampooing their goat. It was this bright white goat, and it was being shampooed. So coming from South Africa, I had never experienced, Qurbani in the way that it happens in India and Pakistan. So this was very interesting. So I was like, oh my goodness, it's very interesting. Firstly, seeing goats around, people playing with goats, treating them as pets was already something interesting. So a domestic animal in urban space as a pet. But this was a particular kind of intimacy. So anyway, I stopped and I was asking them if I could take pictures. And they kind of, welcomed me into their world, which was both a whole economy, right, of sacrifice, of akika, which is the sacrifice for a new child, and of Qurbani, but also of this question that the object of a realization that the animal that is something which is sacrificed or eaten is also at the same time an object of care and love.
Yeah.
And of course, this is something which is completely, goes against the kind of, Hindu nationalist idea which we spoke about earlier, right? Which is that the very fact that you are close to slaughter, the very fact that you can handle this thing means that there is some ethical abjection. You are almost like an abject subject, someone for whom, the basic questions of ethics, of regard for others is completely, deranged. So on the one hand, I think, it clearly does that in some sense, but I like to think maybe one can do more. I like to think, I'm obviously still trying to think about it, but I like to think that in anthropology, we can do more than simply contest a kind of a right-wing idea, right? More than just the good Muslim. And I think doing ethnography around the time of Qurbani also opened this up, right? I mean, there are very masculinist performance and displays of wealth and power happening through the slaughter of goats. There are these very rare, much more rarer instances of people who raise their goats for up to 2 to 3 years, who really cultivate these intimate attachments. And that was something that I found particularly interesting, but they are actually a minority in this place. And then there was this much more widespread practice of bringing these animals into the home for a few days, where children play with them, where the family feeds them. And those, I think, I wonder whether this tells us something. I'm thinking, I'm trying to suggest that it tells us something about what it means to be a subject in relation to other beings who might not necessarily be speaking beings in the way that we think in the humanist terms, but are somehow part of how we form, ethical relations. So I sit with my interlocutors, who I speak about, Aziz, who I was very fortunate to meet, and to sit with these kind of reflections on this relationship to his goat that he that he's no longer with him, that a year later he still remembers that Qurbani, and he tells me, this goat from the market, it's not the same thing, it's not really that. Or himself, interestingly, someone who refuses to do that kind of intimate sacrifice again, because
Yeah.
the whole process of going through that was very painful in this whole thing of forming attachments. So I think, I don't know, for now I've been writing that maybe it asks us to think beyond this idea of the consumer subject or the individual subject.
Yeah.
Yeah,
absolutely. Like, I think I just wanted to ask, like, what drew you to India? Because, like, you were writing in the shadow of the whole, like, beef lynchings and the rising criminalization of Muslim life in India.
Yeah.
And that whole political context, I wonder how that shaped your work, in terms of these questions. And I think, like, what you're talking about, Qurbani, like, especially around Eid, I don't know how it is in India, but the waste that is produced around that, sort of carcasses and non-edible portions of the meat, the way it's like spread into these areas and that type of thing, the city develops a whole different smell, or at a local level. So I wonder, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I mean, of course, it's quite clear, right? The context of the impending arrival of the BJP, the kind of change the past few decades, the kind of the whole change of the political effect, as anthropologists call it, is obviously central. But it is something also that became central over time in my work. So what happened was, like coming into, so first I should tell you that arriving in India or South Asia as my place of research was somewhat by accident. I know that many people in academia develop some kind of fascination with a particular place, a long-standing. For me, I mean, there was a fascination, as in coming from an Indian diaspora. There was some fascination with India. I'd been there at the age of 19 for the first time, and it was something just really interesting to see. But of course, we are also partly because the South African diaspora stretches all the way back to the 19th century. So it's a very long time and a lot of distance, but also there are interesting similarities of food, of various kinds of practices. But to be honest, it was partly by chance, right? So I did my master's work in South Africa on certification. And by the end of that work, I was excited about PhD, but very much not interested in going too much down this road. I felt like this kind of certification, part of this neoliberalization of the economy, leading to supermarkets and supply chains and things, was a relatively predictable movement that was happening.
Yeah.
So, and it was kind of trying to produce this uniformity. So I wanted to see what happened with these things like halal. What happened to these things before we had supermarkets, before we had cold supply chains, chains, meat is moving all over the world. And I had this idea to look at kind of older cities, places where you still find inner city butcher shops and things like this. And my supervisor, I had this idea that I would have, partly shaped by anthropological imagination, that Morocco would be a great place. Go to these old cities, probably Orientalist imagination also. You go to these old cities and you kind of to learn about the networks and how things are done. And my supervisor, who's a scholar of India, of South Asia, he kind of told me, "Oh, look, go to India." He's like, "Look, we're doing India." He made a kind of a comment. He said, "This is old-fashioned 1980s Morocco. The world is moving east. The projects on India and China. You should go to Bombay." He's like, what you're looking for, you're going to find it in Mumbai. You're going to find the new supermarkets. You're going to find the KFCs and McDonald's. And at the same time, you're going to find these old markets. So that was actually it. It was just simply that. And then I thought, okay, well, I have this interest in the space. I've visited there. This would be exciting. So it wasn't like, it was just simply that, right? But because my interest was in these questions, right? Every day, how does Islam, like, what does it mean to understand Islam in everyday life? What does it mean to do an ethnography of Muslims, where we are studying Muslim life outside of the tropes of, say, piety, outside the mosque, outside the seminary, which are the official ways, in the market, with the butcher shop, with the trader. So these were like what I was going to look for. And I started thinking about, well, look at butchers, meat market. I was planning this research. And at the same time, reading about a city like Mumbai, right? So you're reading about Mumbai, and all the work is about abjection. A lot of the work is about marginalization, about violence, about disgust. And so this clearly shaped it, but at the same time, coming into the city and meeting people, I got a different kind of a feel. I made friends with some people and I got a different feel. So I was trying to understand, okay, what's happening here? You've got this politics, but you've got this very secure Muslim community who are so integral to the city, who are
Yeah.
not staying within the confines of their marginalization, who are clearly moving around, who are clearly part of the space. And so in a way, I came back to it then. Later on, I started to think, I think I'm going on too long, but I tried to, yeah.
No, you
Sorry.
have more than enough time.
So
I'm
anyway,
just
yeah,
enjoying
okay.
listening about
Yeah,
your research.
I read some tips on podcasts. I said, don't talk too long. To surmise it, I thought to myself at that point, I was like, well, so we've got this political context, we've got all this affective forces, we've got this economic marginalization and spatial marginalization. But at the same time, I'm meeting people who are fairly secure in space and place and willing to share me my world about their worlds. So I thought, well, my research was very much just focused on their everyday life, on the detailed things that are happening in the butcher store, in the market, in the street side. And all the while aware that at certain points, of course, the question of the state, the question of these broader structural issues are coming up, but allowing them to come up from people rather than me going in to say, well, what's the Indian state doing to you? Or tell us how it is to be a Muslim. Loaded questions, which methodologically to me seem problematic because they take someone who's an object who's an object of a kind of a marginalization process and then ask them to speak for themselves about themselves. Where rather, tell me how you eat. Where do you go? And that was interesting for me because it opened up the city to me. And later on, as I started writing, I thought I started piecing these threads together. And this paper, which you referred to, is kind of an outcome of that, to say, well, where does the political
Absolutely.
emerge?